In this issue of the Strategic Review, Gary Gygax explains the background behind his design for the Dungeons & Dragons magic system, as well as some tips on how to be a better DM. All this and a whole bunch more on today's video. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer. This is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Today we complete our look at the Strategic Review, TSR's original fanzine or newsletter that they put out, which will transition to the Dragon magazine with next issue. This is the Strategic Review number 7 from April of 1976. Hope you enjoyed the video. In today's video, we take our look at the Strategic Review number 7. This is the same size we're used to, magazine sized. Now we have color cover, black and white printing, and the inside is the slick paper folded in half and staples on the side. Take a look at the cover. As noted on the left, we've got several articles they highlight. Gary's talk about the D&D magic system and being a better dungeon master. M.A.R. Barker has an article on TechML for the Empire of the Petal Throne. Gary talks about use of missile weapons in this classic warfare, and it's the demise of the Strategic Review. But like the phoenix rising from the flames, right, we'll have the Dragon magazine that will soon replace it. Here's the cover art. It's a lot of fun. You've got these very colorful elephant here getting ready to stomp on this guy on the ground. There's no attribution given in the magazine itself to anyone for art. There are initials down here at the bottom. I can't really make that out, or I don't recognize that, so I don't know whose art that is. Some of you taking a look at the video may be able to recognize that from something else. Here is the table of contents. I'll get myself out of the way because there's quite a lot here. In the cauldron is the editorial, Gary's article talking about the background and the origins of the D&D magic system, an update on GenCon, an editorial. It's a little bit of their back and forth. I'll call it a feud, sparring maybe with the Origins Con folks, and in particular the people at Avalon Hill. Brian Blume has a new Boot Hill, the fastest guns that never were. This is giving stats to the people from the TV shows and movies. A survey for people who are reading the Strategic Review, mapping the dungeon, which gives you dungeon masters interested in having you participate in their game. What price gold and glory is fantasy fiction, some hints for Dungeons & Dragons judges, magic miscellany, which is new magic items, out on the limb, which is their first letters column. This one actually has letters from Gary, but in the future will have letters from readers. Creature feature, which are new monsters, ancient medieval symbols used for warfare, missile weapons, thief bonuses for dexterity, which is a person who's written in with some ideas for that, an article for Empire of the Petal Throne, and another article for tips for dungeon masters. In terms of contributions, we've got Tim Kask, Mike Reese, Gary, and Brian, who are always there, and then we have article contributions from Joe Fischer, Jim Hayes, David Klempa, Neal Healey, and M.A.R. Barker, who of course is the creator of the Empire of the Petal Throne. Here is the editorial from Tim Kask. And the first thing he does is announce that this is the end of the Strategic Review. But fear not, right? As he says, better things are in the offing. So he announces that the Dragon, which they hadn't told you what that was up until now, they just had those little teasers in there, is the new fantasy role-playing game magazine that will replace the Strategic Review. And then there's going to be another magazine called Little Wars, and what they're going to do initially is publish one every other month. So you get the Dragon one month, you get the Little Wars magazine the next, and that is focused for miniatures enthusiasts, tabletop war gamers, people who want to play things basically other than fantasy. That's going to be a magazine for them. So they sort of see that as the two groups of people who enjoy their products. Obviously, we all know with hindsight, they'll drift much more into focusing on D&D, role-playing games, fantasy and others, but role-playing games in particular in the future. He gives a little bit of background about that. He announces that they've created the new entity, TSR Periodicals, a new sort of subdivision of the company, which Tim will be focused on leading that. And of course, he's the original editor of the Dragon magazine. They also give a little bit of explanation about what they're going to do with subscriptions. They've stopped subscriptions for the pause subscriptions for the moment, and then they're going to give you credit towards the Dragon magazine, which they've kind of calculated out. Like that's, they say that's going to be fair because the Dragon magazine with twice as many pages, and so you'll actually get more sort of pages of content for your money than you were going to get from the existing subscription for the strategic review. Other announcements about the company. Mike Carr is joining them. He's from the Twin Cities, and he's the person who creates Fight in the Skies. Little Bighorn, they say here, is soon to come out. We'll show you later in the advertisement section. There's an advertisement as if it's already done. They say Minifigs and Old Guard are working on the D&D and Empire of the Petal Throne miniatures, and those are expected to come along soon. Dave Sutherland will be joining as a staff artist. We all probably know his name because he's involved in a lot of the art we've seen from the earliest D&D years through the AD&D period. And then they have what I consider to be kind of a little odd article here talking about some different albums you might want to purchase so that you have music to play in the background during your D&D sessions. So that's, for what it's worth, I thought that was kind of interesting. And then they talk about the upcoming Origins 2, and they're going to be there, and there'll be D&D and EPT games happening at that as well. Okay. Here's an important article, I think, or interesting article. This is Gary Gygax's discussion about the magic system. And so it's insightful because he kind of walks you through how he thought about it, right? He says, look, initially we had, wizards in chainmail, and that was for tabletop fantasy war games, right? And so the spells and the way we thought about that was only as making it another troop with the kind of effects that troop could have on a battle. Then as we got into creating the role-playing game, which they didn't call it at that time, he said I had to go back and think about magic. And he said I from fantasy fiction saw 4 different types of magic. And so this was interesting, I thought. So first, there's magic that requires basically a long time, to cast, right? So it's like rituals, there's drawings to be done and things to be read, and it takes a really long time. He says that'd be like Shakespeare or Robert Howard's Conan novels had that type of idea around magic, which is not very helpful for dungeon adventuring because it takes so long you'd never be able to use it. Short spoken spells, he said that you see in Finnish mythology and Jack Vance's fantasy fiction. Ultra powerful uses of magic, he said that tended to be how it was described for DeCamp and Pratt in their fiction. And then things like J.R.R. Tolkien's work, which he described as generally weak and relatively ineffectual magic. And so he said, as I thought about that, basically what I came up with was the thing that fits the way the game's going to play is going to be this Jack Vance or Vancian idea of magic. And he says there we had 4 different parts, verbal components, or something you have to say, somatic or physical movements or gestures you have to make, the psychic or mental attitude necessary to cast the spell, and some type of material adjuncts, basically your material components, something physical that you at times might have to use. As he says, for example, having some water to use to conjure a water elemental. So he says it was assumed D&D would be primarily verbal, but then it would sometimes require some other components. Just the psychic, that's sort of automatically in there, but sometimes you have to be able to make movements, and sometimes you have to have some components. Again, I thought this was interesting. He said, now, in my mind, the spells in this game do 6 different things. Alteration of existing substance, including transposition or dissolution. Creation of a new substance. Changing of normal functions of the mind or body. The addition of new functions to the mind or body. Summoning or commanding existing entities, and creating new entities. He says, in looking at those 6 things, you can think about that and then make them weaker or more powerful depending on what exactly you do within each of those 6 parameters. Again, the other thing he says you had to think about here was this magic user or wizard has to fit within a game where you have fighters and originally clerics. And he very clearly did not want this to become a game of battling wizards, right, where that was basically the only class anyone would pick because they were so much more powerful. And so the idea was I have to create magic in a way that it makes the magic user competitive in terms of being a choice without being too strong or too weak. Some people would say maybe they are too weak initially, but anyway, certainly he was very concerned about having magic users become too strong compared to fighting men, which were the prototypical SNS fantasy fiction heroes, right? Not always, but by and large. He talks about a couple of comments, at least in his opinion. He said we were thoughtful about the spells we would give at each level, and in fact, we did allow, as he calls them, some relatively powerful spells at lower level. And he wants to point out in particular Sleep and Charm Person. Remember, Magic Missile didn't even exist initially. Sleep and Charm Person are probably, very powerful for being just first level spells, but he wanted to give the magic user something of value that he or she could use. And remember, the way this works is he explains it. You memorize that spell. When you cast it, it's completely gone. You have to rest and relearn it before you're going to be able to cast it again. And he takes a moment to explain that, because he said some people thought once you picked a spell for your adventure, then you could just cast that repeatedly. That was your skill, essentially. He's like, and so that's way too powerful because they've got that on auto repeat, right? That casting. He also says people had a misconception that you could read a scroll over and over instead of his rule, which is once the scroll's read, the ink disappears and you've used it once and it's gone. So he says, we've got that issue and we want to correct that so that people can start playing magic users correctly. He said some people, have learned this was my intent. Some people abandoned it and say, I'm playing my own game. And he said, that's okay. He was very open to letting people play however they wanted to back in the early days. He does say some people's homebrew rules are so different, he doesn't really consider them to be playing D&D anymore, maybe inspired by D&D, right? And he has referenced in some other articles the way the game was played by some people on the West Coast out in California he thought was way too, I'll say, liberal or different, because it allowed people to become very high level. It was much more powerful than he ever intended. In fact, he talks in here about the fact that in his game you could be playing for, a year or two and maybe only be 8th, 9th, 10th level. And even though you're playing on a regular basis. And so he gives some context there of how slowly he thinks you should be progressing. And he cautions young DMs or new DMs, not to be too liberal with giving away gold or experience points. So interesting article, I always think, to see what Gary's thinking at the time. Okay, here's their update. They're talking about the upcoming GenCon. They say Bob Blake will need some help. He's going to run a mammoth D&D tournament that takes all of 3 days. And then they also have a competition called Team D&D where you can show up with your own group to play through the Dungeons & Dragons adventures. Mentioned some of the people that will be there: Custom Cast, Minifig, Heritage, McEwen, Cincy C, SBI, Luzaki, Ralpartha, Taurus, and maybe, and Avalon Hill says maybe they're coming. We'll see about that in a minute. And then he talks about some other information, technical information about the hotels and stuff. Jeff Perrin's bringing some movies. I think they had the real movies that you could watch. The Three Musketeers, Robin Hood, and Henry V. He says those will be excellent. And finally, Lynn Lakofka is planning a fantasy miniatures event. And so it'll be like a tournament. You'll be on the other side, start off with 64 players, and you'll work your way through the weekend down to a championship round. Okay, so here's their editorial. This is sharing some information that they got from the folks at Origins. You'll remember in the last issue, right? Or issue 5, I guess, they talked about who's the national convention. GenCon's been here longer. We get people from all over the country, and so there's a little turf war of words going on here. And they say that Don Greenwood, products manager at Avalon Hill, had replied to them and made some assertions and basically pushing back on, who's more important or who's the real national convention. He says, I see why you're angered at the newcomer claiming the first national status, but your convention was never a national convention, and because you did not have the big companies, which are itself Avalon Hill and SPI. You can say what you want about that, but them's the facts. It's kind of their position. And of course, their retort is that it doesn't matter whether a particular company comes to this or not. It's national based on the attendance of the people that come. And we had people from all over the country, so that makes us national. He also points out that SPI did, in fact, come to some Gen Cons in the past. And he said, also, I've talked to SPI, and SPI and Avalon Hill agree Origins is the national convention. We've agreed. And so they take great umbrage with the idea that those companies would think that they get to decide, as if they speak for everyone, what is or is not a national convention. Interesting, TSR in years to come will become a little heavy-handed. At least that's the opinion of many people at smaller gaming companies around the country. But in any event, this is just a little insight into the early dust-up that they had. There'll be a little bit more about that later. Okay, so here is Brian Blume's article for Boot Hill, the fastest guns that never lived. And so I think this is fun. So they give you stats for the Lone Ranger and Tonto, the Rifleman, Clint Eastwood. They said they basically take, mostly it's the guy with no name, but they sort of blend his other Western characters. Yancey Derringer and Pahu, I think I'm saying that correctly. Johnny Yuma, Matt Dillon from Gunsmoke. John Wayne, again, he's an amalgamation of his various Western movie characters. The Paladin, Josh Randall, Yul Brynner, another compilation, and Hopalong Cassidy. And they give them all of their different abilities. And they even have special abilities down here at the bottom based on some of their characteristics from the movies. Here's an announcement. They say free money. If you can get a $1 credit if you fill in this survey. The questions are here in the forms on the last page, so you could cut it out. Typical questions, what's your age, sex, how many years of school, how long have you played, what do you prefer, what time period or style of game do you like, environment, air, sea, land, no combination, no preference, how many games do you own, how many hours do you play, how much do you spend every month, what type of games do you prefer, fantasy, sci-fi, miniatures, etc. And rate your favorite environment, air, sea, land, or combination. Do you own any miniature figures? How many? And if so, what type of collection do you have? Fantasy, military, Napoleonics, etc. And what kind of things are you interested in seeing more of? So, good questions. Mapping the dungeon. This is two things. They announced the arrival of the Character Archaic, which I think was produced by a company called We Warriors. It's basically character sheets. And they're announcing they've seen the sort of prototype, but and they're trying to describe what they think will be the actual product will be a little bit different. And also there'll be this Wizard's Tomb, which is a map you can use for a solitaire dungeon in there. It's pretty rare, pretty collectible item. And then they have some new dungeon masters they're going to give you a list of. Jim Hayes writes, What Price Gold and Glory? And this is a fantasy fiction piece. It's pretty good. Okay, so Joe Fischer's got his article here, Hints for D&D Judges, as he calls them. And he says, get a lot of people now who are players are transitioning over to being referees or dungeon masters. And they have all these ideas for traps and monsters and maybe treasure. One of the things they're not really sure about is setting up the home base. And he encourages them to make sure players have a home base, a place where they can come back and be safe, a place where they can buy and sell stuff that they want or sell stuff they found in the dungeon, and also a place where they can have some town-based adventures to break up the monotony of always going down into the dungeon, all which really good ideas. He has some suggestions for that, and he says, my own first place was called the Black Star. It actually had buildings down on the first level of the dungeon, where there were inns and pubs and different types of shops. He says they had a crazy high-level wizard who had, items for sale, a Balrog butler named Boris. So it seems a little gonzo, but also seems like it was probably pretty fun. And as he says, your creativity is the only bound on what you can end up doing. He said, don't get yourself sort of overextended. Start off with the walls of your town, the physical features nearby. If there's a river, mountains, cliffs, or whatever around the town, then do your interior walls, like maybe around the palace, or section off different sections of the town. Then, depending on the size, if it's bigger, set up maybe quarters, like a thieves' quarter, priest's quarter, merchant's area, place for just basically the people who live there. You do that, do the major buildings in each of those areas, smaller buildings, then you work your way through like the main roads, minor roads, small streets or alleys. That's sort of his suggestion on the way to work your way through that. And of course, don't forget, you got to have a bar or tavern where people can buy drinks, try to gain rumors or information. So you want to stat out some of the common people who would be there, the bartender, the owner, maybe some people who are regulars there. And so have your key non-player characters that they'll encounter around town. Make sure you know who they are. If they have stuff for sale, make sure they're high enough level the characters won't be able to try and take stuff by force rather than paying for it. And if they have magic items or abilities, make sure, equipment and whatever, make sure you've got that sort of figured out in advance. Really good advice. I think everyone's got to have sort of a home-based town that adds a real interesting flavor, I think, to a D&D campaign. So that was pretty good advice from this guy. Then Neal Healey has some new magic items. The Cup and Talisman of Akbar. Basically, you put some water in here, you put the talisman in, and then it can be transmuted into a type of potion, anywhere from a light healing potion, heavy, intensive, the universal antidote, I assume, for poison, cure for all diseases, ointment that'll raise the dead, and a balm for victims of the undead that'll act as a restoration spell. And it randomly determines what it's going to be. And this can only be used by, he says, dervishes, which I think were in a fanzine I saw somewhere. I can't remember which one. Rangers or paladins. Next magic item is the Staff of the Priest Kings. This is the clerical equivalent of the Staff of Wizardry. It has snake staff, sticks to snakes, insect plague, create or pollute food, water, cure or cause disease, continual light, neutralize poison, cure light or serious wounds. It has +1 on spell effectiveness. I don't know if that's supposed to be he add a level to it or what. And then he also says there can be nicer versions of this staff. You roll a D100, 0 to 65, you get the basic staff I just described. And then above that, you can get one that also has a pillar of flame, smoke. You can get one that has an earthquake and hold person. Get one that has raise the dead. Get one that has raise the dead fully. Get one that has restoration and blade barrier, and adds +2 to spell effectiveness. These staffs have 200 charges, but no final strike capacity. That seems crazy overpowered to me. The brazen bottle. This one has a little, I think, double-edged sword kind of thing. So this is a bottle. It's a flask. It's corked. And he said it'll have a red seal on it with some mystical runes. If you open it, if it's empty, you can use it and compel 1 to 6 Djinni or 1 to 2 Afridi's to sort of go in, transform and go into the bottle. And then you can cork it, and then they're captured. He can also try to jug a Balrog, Invisible Stalker, Air Elemental, Fire Elemental, or other type of demon. He says anything that goes in here will be really angry when it gets back out. And so the other option, when it's found by the party, is to find that something on that list is already in there and may come out and be very angry. Doesn't say there's any ability here to compel service by having them possessed inside of this bottle. And he says you can decide, maybe it's been in there so long it'll actually be happy about it and may serve you for 1,001 days. But in many cases it may just try to kill you. So that's interesting. Here in the middle of the magazine, they have this spread, Discover the Dungeon. This is the Dungeon Hobby Shop where they're selling things. They've got some photographs. They reproduce okay. The first picture on the top left is just a picture of the walls and the racks with different stuff in it. Then there's some more miniatures in the background with little dioramas in the front. Bottom left, you have a picture of Terry Kuntz, who they have said repeatedly did so much work to get this ready. Then in the middle, you've got Gary upstairs at his office, and Brian Blume there. He's trying to do some graphic design. And on the right-hand side, they have taken some photographs of some different war games in progress. So out on a limb is going to be the letters column in Dragon Magazine, but they start it here. These are both letters from Gary. So the first one is their response to that editorial or the comments they got from Avalon Hill. And he's talking here about this whole question of GenCon versus Origin. What's a national convention? Who was first? Who's biggest? Who's whatever? And so the first thing they do is they talk about the dispute over attendance. He said because they counted, the Origins has claimed that, well, you didn't count people right. Only 900 people who came paid, so you can't count the people who didn't pay. Origins, all 1,500 people paid, and so less people paid, so we're a bigger convention. And they also said if we counted the people who didn't, pay, like volunteers or whatever, then we would have been bigger. So whatever, I guess is my view here. We come 50 years later. And then there's this dispute over wargaming and board gaming and whether this is a national convention because Avalon Hill and SPI were not there. And again, they say, look, we had all kinds of vendors, people from the hobby who were there, and we had people from all over the country. And so, we think that's clearly what makes it a national convention. No one person gets to decide whether or not a convention is national in scope. The other thing he talked about is how they've always had board games and war games, and he does say, GenCon has had more miniatures, whereas the Origins convention, it's only been one so far, sort of ignored the miniatures aspect of the hobby. So that's, sort of their response, and they also talk a little bit about the different things that are there. Obviously, they're oldest. They say, you did previously refer to us as the premier wargaming event, and we're sort of like claiming that, take backs, right? That is who we are. So, this will go on back and forth for quite a while as these two sort of conventions are rivals with each other. The second letter from Gary talks about just a little retrospective. He talks about the origins of his hobby and how he was really out on a limb with this new game he came up with. But now it's really caught on. And he sees, we see fantasy figures being offered by a number of different companies. We've got some periodicals that give us a decent amount of attention with miniature gaming as well as promoting the fantasy hobby. And he announces how the strategic review is going to evolve into the Dragon, and if there's interest, it'll evolve into Little Wars magazine, which it did for a while, right? But then that eventually went away. So interesting, sort of some interesting historical views of Gary at the time. This article by Gary is Ancient Medieval Standards and Symbols, and just how you could draw different symbols, and he explains it to you to tell whether something, if you drew a map, light infantry, cavalry, crossbow troops, slingers, catapults, darts, archers, war elephants, chariots, And so he says, you could do this to draw a map. You could use it in a play-by-mail game. You want to show which troops are moving where. Or if you wanted to explain like a recreation of something that had been played on your table, you could use these symbols. Then he has an article on missile weapons in classic warfare. And, he's written some this classical warfare wargaming rules recently. And he talks about slings, arrows, how those different things could have been or were used historically. And gives some explanation about that, the weapons, the techniques that they use, the kind of spacing they would need based on how they would fight, damage they could do, et cetera, et cetera. And in particular, he talks a lot about archers and sling throwers, I guess you'd call them here. And here's a drawing of the different types of bows that he had in there just for historical reference. David Klempa has this idea for thieves getting bonuses on their thieving skills based on dexterity, just like fighters have the extraordinary. If they have an 18, they get to roll a D100 and have a, quote, extraordinary strength. Well, he wants to have 18 dexterity for thieves. They can get extraordinary dexterity. He first starts off with the dexterity scores and the bonuses you get for traps, locks, climbing, pickpockets, move silent, hide shadows. And then he gives you this D100 roll to add on to that, and you can get even better dexterity. The next is an article from Barker on Empire of the Petal Throne, and I haven't played that game. I do have it, but so this maybe didn't make as much sense as it should have. But he said a bunch of people wanted to know what's going on in this world news of happenings, right, within the Empire. And so this is written like little snippets from announcements that a herald would have read in the town square to tell you about different things that were going on around the Empire. Here's some artwork. Some of this is by Barker, like this. I think this is also his, although this one isn't labeled. This one is David Sutherland. He's drawn this really interesting creature. Sort of looks like a Zorn, but with some differences, but similar. And then finally there's this warrior, and this one's labeled by Barker as well. And then there's the second article for tips for DMs, and this one's written by Gygax. And as he says, the Dungeons & Dragons is only going to be as good as the dungeon master running the game. He refers to him interestingly here as the DM up on the top. He also calls him the referee in the article. He says, look, this is a game of three things: skill, memory, and luck. And skill, he says, blend of knowledge of the rules and the game's background. Memory is the ability to recall different functions and ways to do things. And luck, of course, is the least important, but it is a factor because you have, die rolling. Oh, desire, skill, and luck. Desire is initiated by participating in the game and a reflection of the ability to maintain interest. So desire, skill, and luck. He says, adventurers in the campaign grade their play to the referee. He says, this dungeon master needs to suit the campaign to the participants. There has to be this interaction between the two in order for both of them to basically enjoy the game and want to continue to play. He cautions, do not win the player's favor by turning your game into, as he calls it, a gift shop or a Monty Hall campaign where they get all this stuff and they get it way too easily. Also, don't let them get up in levels too high, too fast, because they'll get bored if they aren't earning the improvements. Plus, he says, the game's not really designed for 40th level players. 1st to 10th, that's sort of the sweet spot of the campaign. And that's the part when, at least in his view originally, he transitioned into building a castle, a keep. The thief would become the local, head of the local thieves guild. Wizard would build his tower. Now you become responsible for an area, like a barony around your home base. And then you've got those sort of political and sort of responsibilities that come with governing and taking care of the people in an area. So anyway, that's his caution on that. And the final thing is the sort of handing out of magic items and the presence of magic, which he cautions again, that should be somewhat limited. You don't want just this factory of magic items that people get, because again, it's basically the same theory. They become too powerful too quickly. The other thing he says, I think that's interesting, he cautions, or he suggests, that you should have absolute disinterest. If someone puts their character into stupidly, he says, into a circumstance where they can be killed, let them be killed, he says. That's what they've got to learn that. They've got to know that death is real, and you shouldn't be just saving bad play decisions, save them from those. He does say you can't have divine intervention, in his view, rarely when you feel like the player really shouldn't, fate was conspired against the player. The player was basically making good decisions, but the dice rolled poorly, and a character ends up killed. He's like, in that circumstance, maybe you give the player a way out. But he said there again, you certainly can't do that every time the game becomes too easy and death is not a real threat, which he feels is something that gives a real sort of energy to the game, is that the fact that you can lose your characters. And then finally he says, in your dungeons, give the people that are there, the humanoids or the NPCs, the bad guys, the big bad guys, if you will, some type of personality, and make them act accordingly, right? So if they know someone's hunting for them or searching for them or trying to rob them, they're going to set traps, defenses, and use their knowledge of the dungeon to fight back. And so that's a pretty good idea as well. And then finally he says, when these people come back to town, you need to make them pay through the nose for something they want, especially if it's like a resurrection spell or something that they cure wounds or cure disease spell. The players will be sort of over a barrel. Plus, he wants to extract that gold from them so that they can't be too rich too quickly. And so his final comment here is remember, this is a game designed around progression. And so, right, the leveling up and the gaining of new abilities. And so a good dungeon master will strike the right balance of make people sort of work for and earn those things. And the more they have to work for it and earn it, the more they'll appreciate it and value and get joy out of doing that, right? So if it's too easy, in particular, that's his big caution. If it's too easy, they won't really get the enjoyment they could out of the game. Then we have, so that's it for the articles. It's a couple pieces of art and cartoons here. So the first one, Omar, how long have we been in the dungeon? 6 years. You think we'll ever be rescued? I sure hope so. Why? And this guy says, I imagine my subscription to the Strategic Review needs renewing. And then the guy says, Irving, and the guy says, right behind you, Omar. And there's a third set of eyes. Then here's this illustration. This style's in all of them. I don't really know who, I get myself out of the way, whose initials these are down here at the bottom. It says, so you stand and fight, eh? And the player says, yep. And in his mind, he's like, ta-da. Beat, hack, cut, slice, kill. And then the dungeon master says, you chipped him. And then his vision of grandeur goes away. Then there's some advertisements in here that I thought were interesting and worth taking a quick look at. First is a full-page ad from TSR announcing its new book, which is Eldritch Wizardry, which is the third supplement for the original D&D rules, in which they're advertising ancient and powerful magic, psionic abilities, the new druid character class, demons, artifacts, relics, and outdoor encounter tables. Then this full-page ad is for a GenCon IX, labeled at the top, the nation's premier wargame convention, and 3 full days of gaming in August. Special guest is Fritz Lieber. The seminars, dealers, auctions, movies, miniatures, board games, fantasy, and more. Again, this is still in Lake Geneva. This full-page ad for products starts with the game Little Bighorn, which they've been talking about for the last couple of issues. You can recreate the battle of George Custer against Native Americans. And then the bottom half, they advertise their 2 new magazines, Little Wars, the journal for historical battle game enthusiasts, and The Dragon, the magazine of fantasy, swords and sorcery, and science fiction gaming. A couple pieces of art. This one, so I think it says Jake, 1976, a dragon and a wizard at the front. I thought that was pretty cool. And then this is David Sutherland's drawing of a dragon. This one appears in one printing, I think, of the B2 Keep on the Borderlands. But in any event, here's one of Dave Sutherland's early drawings of dragons. Quite good, especially compared to the other illustrations that are there at the time. I pop myself out of the way. You guys can see that a little better. All right. And then one more. There's a squiggly line down the middle. The left side says the referee's view. The right side is the player's view. And so the right side, the players are like, it's all clear ahead, men, because there's a corner, right? And then from the referee's view, you see on the other side of the corner, and there's a whole bunch of, I think, goblins maybe, and a wizard waiting for them when they come around the corner. And then we've got these 2 players, and the DM's back behind the DM screen, right? And he says to them, hey guys, pass that box of dice down here. I have to check this monster's hit points. And they're like, ruh-roh, there's a lot of dice in there. I never was a guy who had a lot of dice. I had my 6 dice. I was good to go. A couple other advertisements. They still have an advertisement in here for Origins. I get the sense that they are trading, like basically advertising each other's conventions for free, but I might be wrong about that. But in any event, Origins 2 is coming up in July over in Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland. Diplomacy World continues to be advertised. And then new news, GenCon West out in San Jose, California, and that's happening in September. The back page, again, has an advertisement of things you can buy from TSR Hobbies. You've got all the D&D stuff and other games that they produce, percentile dice, posters, hex sheets, other games, and things from other companies as well. So that's our look at the strategic review number 7, and that completes the review, or the look at the strategic review. That's 1 through 7, that's all of them. So next time we'll take a look at something different. I'm kind of considering whether to go forward and just start with the Dragon magazine, or look at something like White Dwarf that came a little later from the UK, or look at some other periodicals that were come a little later in time, but still are professional sort of magazines. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope you're subscribed. If you have friends who might enjoy this, please send them our way. We're continuing to grow our subscriber base. Hope you have a great day. Until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.